Hi everyone. So a few days ago I got a question about how do you change exposure compensation using the D-pad instead of using the dials. And this was for the OM-5. I have the Olympus EM5 Mark III here, but it's exactly the same. Now by default, the camera will let you adjust the exposure compensation using the D-pad, but you have to push this button first here on top. So, because by default, the D-pad will adjust the focus or target point on the camera. But if you push the exposure compensation button here first, you'll see some directional arrows come up on some settings here. And then by pushing right or left, that will adjust the exposure compensation up and down on the D-pad. And depending on what exposure mode you're in, pushing up and down on the D-pad will allow you to adjust the other exposure setting. So for example, if you're in aperture priority mode and you push the exposure compensation button, pushing left and right will adjust the exposure compensation, and pushing up and down will adjust the aperture. And if you're in shutter priority, pushing up and down will adjust the shutter speed. All right, so let me give you a quick demo of how this works. So I'm in program mode, and here's the exposure compensation button. And then down here on the screen, you'll see we have shutter speed, aperture, and then the exposure compensation. And of course, by default, rotating the front dial changes the exposure compensation. And when we're in program mode, rotating the rear dial changes between program mode and program shift mode. But if I want to change the exposure compensation using the D-pad, because by default the D-pad right now just moves the target point. To make it change the exposure compensation, all I have to do is push the exposure compensation button on top, and then you'll notice that there's some directional arrows over the exposure compensation setting. And that's when I can just adjust the exposure compensation using the D-pad by pushing left and right based on the arrows. Now pushing up and down will put the camera into program shift mode, and in this case it's adjusting the aperture. Now if I go into aperture priority, here on the mode dial, you can see that the camera is now in aperture mode. Let me toggle to a simpler display here. And then again, I can rotate the front and rear dials to adjust the exposure compensation, and the rear dial now adjusts the aperture. But if I push the exposure compensation button, you'll notice the directional arrows on top. So pushing left and right will raise and lower the exposure compensation, and pushing up and down now adjusts the aperture. Going in the shutter priority mode, again, the front dial changes exposure compensation, the rear dial adjusts shutter speed. And then pushing the exposure compensation button does the same. Left and right for exposure compensation, up and down in this case is not changing the shutter speed. All right, now this is where it gets a little strange. When I go into manual mode, you'll notice that I have my shutter speed and aperture setting here, and that's what the front and rear dials will adjust now. So front dial is adjusting aperture and not exposure compensation, and the rear dial is now changing the shutter speed. And of course the D-pad is adjusting the target point. But if I push the exposure compensation button, you'll notice that the directional arrows are now over the shutter speed and aperture, but not for the exposure compensation. So manual mode's kind of the exception, but I'm going to go ahead and push that. And now I can adjust the aperture, pushing left and right, and then pushing up and down, I can adjust the shutter speed. However, if I do want to adjust the exposure compensation in manual mode using the D-pad, what I have to do is push and hold the exposure compensation button, and you'll see the exposure compensation setting is now displayed, and I can push left and right to change that. I can rotate the rear dial to change it, and I can push up and down on the D-pad to change it. So pushing and holding the exposure compensation button allows me to adjust the exposure compensation in multiple ways. And then finally, if I put the camera into movie mode, it's the same. I can use the front and rear dials to adjust exposure compensation, or I can push the exposure compensation button and then use the D-pad to change it that way. Now there is a way to change exposure compensation directly on the D-pad without having to push the exposure compensation button first. All you do is you reassign the exposure compensation button to the D-pad. Now you're going to lose the AF target point direction or being able to move it around with the D-pad, but you won't have to push this first if you want to change exposure compensation. So let me show you how to do that. All right, so I put the camera back into a photo mode, aperture priority in this case. So let's go into the menu. And we're going to go down to the custom menu here, the cogwheel, click over to the right, go down to menu B for button, click over to the right again, button function, click OK. And then we're going to scroll down to the D-pad button, which is this icon here. And we're going to click over to the right. And we're going to change this to direct function. So we have three options here. We have the D-pad assigned now to change the AF target area. We can disable it or turn it off. So if we push this D-pad, nothing's going to happen. Or we can set it to direct function. So we're going to click OK. And then here we can assign pushing down on the D-pad or pushing right on the D-pad. So currently, if we push down on the D-pad, it's assigned to change the shutter mode. And if we push right on the D-pad, it's assigned to change the flash mode. However, by default, and it's not listed here, pushing left on the D-pad will still allow you to change the AF target area, and pushing up on the D-pad is actually exposure compensation now. So I'm just going to change one of these. I'm going to change the right arrow here, and I'm going to change that to adjust the ISO, for example. I'm going to click OK. And there's several options here. You can kind of go through those on your own. But now when I push right on the D-pad, that adjusts the ISO like I just changed. If I push down on the D-pad, that's going to change the shutter mode. And if I push left on the D-pad, I can change the target point still, just like I did before. And if I push up on the D-pad, I can now change exposure compensation by clicking left and right on the D-pad. So that's another way you can do it. Now, I should mention that even though we assign the D-pad to control direct functions, up to do exposure comp, left to do control point, etc., the exposure compensation button here on the top of the camera hasn't changed. It's still the exposure compensation button. We didn't reassign that one. So you can see when I push it, it toggles the exposure compensation feature. And then I can go back to the D-pad and adjust the aperture and exposure compensation just as before. So everything's the same here. Nothing has changed. All right, so now I'm going to put the camera into a movie mode because it's a little bit different here. If I push over to the left, I can change the AF target area. Pushing up lets me change the exposure compensation. Pushing down, you'll see that it changes the white balance. And then pushing to the right doesn't seem to be doing anything. And you'll see why in just a second. So I'm going to push on the menu. And I'm going to go into the movie menu here, because you can actually assign different functions to the D-pad separate from what you set in the movie photo modes. So let's go to, let's see, button, dial lever, button function, click over to the right, and we'll scroll down to the D-pad. That's set to direct function by default. And you'll see the down arrow is set to white balance, but the right arrow is set to electronic zoom. And because I'm using a prime lens, that's why when I was pushing to the right, it wasn't doing anything. So if I'm using a prime lens in movie mode, I may want to change this to something else like ISO, for example. All right, so let's take a look. If I push down, I get the white balance setting. I push to the right, I get the AF target area setting. If I push up, I get the exposure compensation. And then if I push to the right, still nothing's happening. And that's because, at least on the M5 Mark III, this may have changed on the OM-5, is when I'm in movie mode, I cannot use auto ISO unless, I cannot change the ISO unless I'm in full manual mode. I'm forced to use auto ISO in any other mode. So let's go into the menu and go into mode setting. Click over to the right, click over to the right, and we're going to manual mode. And now, if I click to the right, I can change the ISO, but I cannot select auto ISO. So when I'm in manual mode in movie mode, I have control over all three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So since I can't use auto ISO, there's no way to use exposure compensation, so it's not available to me. Even if I push and hold, I cannot change exposure compensation, again, because I'm fixed on all of the different exposure settings. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to adjust exposure compensation through customizing the buttons and dials and the D-pad. And of course, there are some limitations there as well, but hopefully I was able to answer your question. And if you enjoy these kind of videos, you want to support the work that I do here, you can buy me a coffee from the links below, make a donation, or you can become a member. But either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.